Hello, I'd like to present to you a short video, which was actually made for my family, but I decided to share it with the world because it involves very, very important historic events and the role of just one man and one family in those events. For many years, I had been looking for the last resting place of my great-grandfather, Joseph Horton, who was killed in action in September 1915 at the First Battle of Loos. It took me a long time to find him because I had been given wrong information and I was looking in the wrong place. But once I actually stumbled last year upon an old wedding certificate, everything fell into place and I was able to find him. The film you're about to see was actually made last year on Remembrance Day. And of course it was a very busy time, so I decided to hold it back until this year and to release it today, being of course Remembrance Day. I hope you find this very interesting. So this is the Loos British Memorial. Here we have the names of 20,000 British soldiers whose bodies were never found, never identified. There are a lot of graves here which just say an unknown soldier. Conceivably, our great-grandfather Joseph Horton could be in one of those graves. We'll never know. We'll never know. It's taken me a long time to find this spot because I was looking for years for the wrong name in the wrong place at the wrong year. I was looking for a different Horton who was killed in a different part of France in 1916. Actually, Joseph Horton was killed very close to where I'm standing now in 1915. He served with the 1st Battalion of the South Staffordshire Regiment. This was a very distinguished battalion. Just a little bit of history here. Many of you may have seen the film Gordon of Khartoum with Charlton Heston playing General Gordon. Well, in that film, the column of soldiers that were heading up the Nile to try to break the siege of Khartoum, that was the 1st Battalion of the South Staffordshire Regiment. They then served with some distinction in the Boer War. In the First World War, as our great-grandfather would have joined, they moved in October 1914 to Belgium. Initially to Zeebrugge, to the port at Zeebrugge, then they passed through Antwerp. They may have been part of the defence of the port of Antwerp. There was a small siege there, which successfully kept the port for some time out of German hands. They then moved here to Loos, and on September the 25th, 1915, the First Battle of Loos began just in fields opposite where I'm standing. It was a debacle, unfortunately. The name of General Haig and the word debacle seem to come together quite often through history, and had somebody else been in charge on that day, maybe the result would have been different. It was a very fierce battle. The Allied troops were left with 60,000 casualties. The Germans, somewhere around a third of that. Germans were dug in behind their artillery was on the reverse slopes. They were even firing machine guns from reverse slopes. The British had no way of dealing with this. Inadequate artillery, no howitzers to drop down on the German positions. During a gas attack, British troops were sent forward with defective gas masks, and you don't want to imagine. When you come here, and also to the grave, the cemetery, which is about 2 miles away from here, a lot of Canadian graves, and I'm very delighted to see that the Canadians have actually taken the trouble to place small flags. I wish that the British Embassy were here today, but I see nothing, I'm afraid to tell you. The battle itself lasted some days, and it ended with a British defeat. Despite the efforts of the British troops, the Canadian troops, and wonderful contributions by the Indian cavalry, 2 troops of Indian cavalry took part in this. Can you imagine cavalry going into battle and Indians? I discussed this yesterday with an Indian friend, a diplomat in Brussels, and left there a small memorial cross with a poppy for the embassy. We know who our friends are at these times. More to say, maybe not everybody knows the full family history. Obviously our grandmother Mary Horton and her two siblings Joseph Jr., who served with some distinction in the Royal Air Force in the Second World War, and Amy, who was a wonderful character. Unfortunately none of them are with us anymore. After Joseph Horton was killed, the way that it worked in the First World War is that on the day after a soldier was killed, his pay stopped. So the family had nothing. And our great-grandmother was not able to cope with 3 children. There was no welfare state in those days. She would have been destitute. The children were put up for adoption, and they were adopted by the Needle family in Watford, who very kindly adopted all 3 of them. In those days, that was considered to be a duty to adopt the orphans of war dead. They moved to Watford. Mary Horton met our grandfather, and the rest is history. All's well that ends well. It's interesting to speculate, had he survived, had Joseph Horton survived, how things would have turned out differently. Anyway, here we are at last. I believe that I'm the first member of the family to actually visit here since 1915. These panels have been here since the 1920s, and that's all really I can say about that. It's a very dignified place, it's a very beautiful place, and very quiet. This photograph actually shows the moment on the 25th of September where the chlorine gas actually took place, and it's a very hazy photograph, but you can actually see the troops advancing into the gas. This picture was taken on the 25th of September, on the day that our great-grandfather died. These particular soldiers are actually from one of the London regiments, so these are not the South Staffs, but this is probably the only photograph that actually shows what our great-grandfather would have seen in his own eyes. There is actually a photograph of the 1st Battalion just after their arrival in Belgium. This photograph I obtained courtesy of the National Army Museum in Chelsea in London. We don't know who are the men in this photograph, but they are from the 1st Battalion. It is not inconceivable that one of these men is actually our great-grandfather. Given the way that the army recruited in those days, the battalion would have all been recruited from the same area. In fact, our great-grandfather was from Aston, Birmingham. Certainly he would have known the men in these pictures, or at least 1 or 2 of them. This is the only photograph that I can actually find of the 1st Battalion in Belgium. Concerning the poison gas attack, I mentioned the name Haig in association, as always, with the word debacle. It was on Haig's orders that the British used chlorine gas. Unfortunately, the wind was blowing in the wrong direction and it blew back at them. It blew back into the faces of the advancing soldiers with, as I mentioned, very, very poor quality gas masks, and actually into the trenches. Chlorine gas generally didn't kill, but it left people blinded and debilitated. And just a little point here, a little piece of information. I'm sure that, like myself, you all love that movie, or sorry, that television series, Dad's Army. Well, Private Godfrey, who played the medic in Dad's Army and who was always talking about his sister Dolly and her cupcakes, Private Godfrey was actually one of those soldiers who was gassed in that attack. The Battle of Loos, notable for another famous person, a casualty who died, and that was John Kipling, known as Jack Kipling, who was the son of Rudyard Kipling. Rudyard Kipling himself couldn't cope with the loss and spent many years wandering around France in the hope that he would find his son alive. Of course, that was not to be the case. Loos is also notable because it was the first time that the British Royal Flying Corps ever carried out a tactical bombing raid. That is, they had particularly targeted German trenches. This was the very first tactical bombing raid in the history of aerial warfare, and that was overseen by Trenchard, who on April the 1st, 1918, went on to found what is now the Royal Air Force. And so, I hope indeed that was interesting and informative. For me, finding that memorial was significantly emotional. I do believe, as I mentioned in the video, that I was the first person to visit. I hope I won't be the last. And if any family members do want to go along and visit the memorial at Luce, let me know. I'll help you to get there. Many thanks.